Most people think a quantity surveyor just helps you claim tax deductions. But as my guest today reveals, that's only a fraction of what they do. I'm joined by Marty Sadlier, Director of MCG Quantity Surveyors, to break down the entire construction process from a QS's perspective. From feasibility studies and cost plans, to tender reviews, contract clauses, and progress payments. If you've ever wondered how to keep your construction project on budget, avoid disputes, and make sure you're comparing apples to apples, this episode will show you exactly why every serious developer and investor needs a quantity surveyor on their team. Let's get into it.
Marty Sadlier, thanks for joining me back on Geared for Growth.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
It's been a while between drinks, probably years at the very least. I think the last time we caught up, we were talking about underinsurance and some of the research that you've been crunching on that. But I wanted to get you back to go into the opportunity to dive into some of the more traditional quantity surveying services. Now, what we have in common is that we both have a Bachelor of Construction Management and are quantity surveyors per se. However, I'm really stuck in my tax nerd box, and you're the guy that does all of the services and many things that property investors that are involved in renovations or developments, those sorts of things, feasibilities, that might not necessarily know that you do. So just to kick us off, in terms of quantity surveying, what are the roles that a quantity surveyor can have across the lifespan of a project?
Yeah, so I guess the quantity surveying term is maybe a bigger umbrella for two major roles, which is an estimator and a cost planner. So one estimating quantities and the other one putting costs against those, so the cost planner. So it's really the marriage of those two things that, broadly speaking, make up the quantity surveying role. We'll be working with people from the back of a serviette thinking about building a house or thinking about doing a development, so feasibility type stuff, whether this is even in their pipe dream to do. Okay, we won't have full design then, so we're working more on benchmarking and other jobs that we've worked on that are of similar nature and the like, right through to a particular trade that has full documentation that just wants us to cost one trade. It can be as narrow as that focus.
Yeah. So, for example, if there is a tradie that just does cabinetry or joinery or painting, you could actually just do an estimate on that particular trade to help them to budget or to win work. How would that work?
Yeah, absolutely. So we might work with a renderer because they've been given a massive set of plans for a 30-unit development, and they've been asked to put a tender in for render. The best use of their time isn't coming home from work with a pen and paper to try and work that out. So while they're on site making their crust, we can be doing that in the background, and then providing them what the quantities are, and they might be able to put their own cost centres against that, or equally, they may want us to look at it more from a market rate compared to what other people might be pricing it at.
Yeah. So before you were sort of saying there's two components. There's the quantities part of it, and then there's the cost part of it, or the cost planning side of things. So from a quantities perspective, if you're a renderer, presumably okay, well, this is how much I charge per square metre, and these are my costs of materials and all those sorts of things. So you're literally just going there and measuring off the plans how many square metres worth of rendering there is?
Yeah, that's right. And the different types, like it might be the face or the reveal, because in their mind, they might have a different rate for those kind of things, like in and around windows or doorways or the like. So, we will just do the quantities for that instance. It's no different to potentially a homeowner wanting to go to 3 or 4 builders and get a price and want to be able to control the conversation and certainly the landscape by it being apples and apples. They don't want to have to try and work out the differences between all the different builders' pricing because they're doing it themselves. So they'll get a QS or a quantity surveyor in that instance to do the estimating part of it only, which is do all the quantities. So they would call that an unrated, no rates against an unrated bill. So we would provide that to them that they can then shoot off to however many people and say, can you please put a cost against that? And that way when it comes back in, that they're able to sort of assess it more on an apples by apples scenario in their world of naivety, which they're entitled to be, right? As opposed to engaging the quantity surveyor to go and do that whole tender review process.
Yeah, awesome. I want to dive into that into a little bit more detail, but just from a context point of view, you've worked on everything from small resi stuff to huge commercial and industrial projects. Can you walk us through the stages where a QS typically gets involved? For example, is it always at the start from a feasibility, or can quantity surveys come in at a later stage?
Oh, we definitely come in at a later stage, and sometimes it's probably to the detriment of a job because it's that afterthought. And I think I've spoken to people in the past about, there's a bit of a differing between, say, the European English idea of a quantity surveyor and the Australian version, where the easiest way to explain it is just for someone at home, go and watch Grand Designs UK and Grand Designs Australia. You won't see a quantity surveyor or even they won't even mention it in the Australian version, but in the UK version, the QS is on site with a high vis in every episode. So there's just a differing sort of impact that they have on a job. We inevitably get engaged a lot because the client or our end client has been told you should use a QS. So when they've heard about that journey, it's normally a lot further into it. The really good operators and people that understand what a quantity surveyor can do for them, they want to get them involved really early. So they're people who are looking at, so more maybe, yes, we're talking about developers, but I'll change that title to investor at the moment because a lot of times when we're talking to developers, they're not living in it, right? They're looking at it purely as a financial transaction. Am I even going to entertain buying that site? Am I going to actually be able to make money on it? Yes, we'll engage a real estate agent to do a bit of a gross realisation on what I can sell it for. That's going to be my total, revenue. What am I going to have to spend on this to get it to that point to work out what my profit margin is? We can work with them on that. So it doesn't exist at this stage. That they're the good operators that are trying to build that relationship, because once we've got an idea of what they're trying to achieve and what their product is, so a developer will have a niche, they'll have a particular flavour that they like to go down. It might be investor quality finishes, or it might be high end, or it might be big, or it might be small, high yield. So we'll get an idea of their flavour of what they're trying to achieve, and then we can then apply that throughout the job. So when they want to do value engineering, or it's not quite stacking, or when they get to council and council now impose you can't do that many height level, or you've got to change a facade, we're already across it. They're not re-engaging a whole conversation and trying to give 6 months of background to a consultant. They're already on the job. So for them, time is money. It's holding costs. So for them to be able to have a relationship with a QS from the start, that they don't have to catch them up to speed all the time, that's priceless for them.
Well, let's go through a little bit of a structured stage-based part of a project and how a quantity surveyor can help out. So if we think about early stage, like the feasibility and the cost planning side of things, what's the value of bringing a QS in before they even break ground?
So is this development even going to stack? If I was to buy this block of land and build a 5-unit development on it, and then I sell it, will I even cover my costs of finance, and am I going to be in front or behind? So understanding whether this is something that is going to be, negative or positive from a cash flow point of view. Are you going to retain some, or are you just going to sell the whole amount? So understanding construction costs is part of that. There are other development costs that will go along with that, with approvals and the timeframes and holding costs and real estate and solicitors and those kind of things. But certainly understanding that fluid nature of construction cost is pretty important. And it's not always just, we'll have some developers that may have done lots of developments before, but not in this suburb or not in this city. And so trying to apply construction costs of builders they've used before, they're suddenly not using those builders. So they've got to understand what the market rate is going on in that site or that area location.
There's a big difference also, as far as I understand it, between, say, scope and budget. And that's an area where people might be looking at designing something and you're able to do some cost engineering to help it sort of go within a budget. And I assume that there's a bit of a tension with, say, an architect that's wanting to build something quite grand and then the client's budget being a constraint. How does a QS come in and help with that relationship?
Yeah, well, I think as a generalized statement, architects are creative people, right? And normally when they're dealing with someone that is, especially if it's a principal place of residence, or their first or a couple of developments, they're pretty emotionally invested, right? So they are normally, you've got a risk-adverse person, and you've got a very creative mind. So in some cases, there's almost a bit of a misbalance there in that regard, right? Because you've got a bit of a conflicting idea from either party, and certainly our role is to try and be as independent as possible with that. We might be engaged by one or either of those parties, but certainly we aren't emotionally invested in it. We're not a builder that's saying, oh yeah, I can build that for $1 million, just to further the conversation down the road, to then hopefully be in a position to sign a contract or be considered. So we don't have that emotional investment in the job. So, but those other two parties, the architect and the client, they're both invested, right? So, we've got an architect that might be given a budget they've got to meet, or a program that they've got to meet, or conversely, the client has a budget that they can't go past. So, we're trying to manage that as best as possible. Also, early on in that relationship, depending on how the contractual arrangement has worked between those two entities, an architect might be doing, pro bono work to try and progress this to a point to see whether the client is going to be able to commit to this job. Or it could be that the architect's getting paid a reasonable amount straight up. Different architect firms, different sort of models, but someone is incurring costs during that time. So even a job that doesn't go ahead, someone has incurred costs along that way. So being able to get some pretty strong numbers around early on can help to either waste money down a job that's just not going to happen. And we hear about architects that people come with these massive pipe dreams about what they want, but they're just not able to deliver it from a price point of view. And equally, architects also are sort of engaged because of their expertise and their creativity. And usually a client has reached out to an architect because they've been on their website and seen what they can do, and they really resonate with that style of architecture. But then not knowing what price ticket that comes with.
Yeah. So at that stage, what sort of report would you be engaged to do? Would it be something like a preliminary cost plan? And if so, what are kind of the inclusions, and how can the client or the architect or the developer use that?
Yeah, so it would be a high level estimate, which would be a preliminary cost plan, because the information we have is preliminary. Or they call it a high level estimate because they haven't really delved into too much more than that. This is usually well before you've even got council approval. So you're trying to understand. So council approval is more, how is this going to look in the street, and are we going to allow that type of development and that type of facade or look to be in our LGA or in that particular street? We're before that at the moment. We're looking at the creative juice around, is this something that the client's going to be able to afford if this goes further, and is the architect putting down on paper what the client expectations are? Have they covered that scope off? So it's very much a scoping stage at that point. And then we would be looking at costs going, okay, this isn't a high volume project build where they can easily go and walk through that particular house or see that particular house in any number of locations, right? So for us, it's a bespoke thing for both parties, and we're trying to ascertain what we could put against that as a cost. So we're working on benchmarking exercises of properties that are very similar by design or fit out or level of finish, and they could be anywhere in Australia. And then we have to apply a location indice to where it's going to be built. Or equally, it might be that we're looking at lots of developments that we've done in that particular area, but then applying a markup due to quality or the services or the level of finish that they're going to be including. It's not necessarily an easy exercise when we're looking at certain bespoke things. You can have a house now built out of precast, so you might have done that kind of internal finish before, but not in a residential setting with precast, or there might be no providers of precast in that particular area. So it's now going to have to be built off-site, or precast is off-site, but further away. So you've got more travel or transport costs to getting it to site. So there are a lot of little factors that we have to sort of take into account. But we'll be looking at benchmarked exercises of lots of other developments and then applying that to the gross floor area of that property. So the likely footprint and size of that property, taking into account if it's multiple levels or a single sort of story.
So you'll have the total cost or the estimate that you think it would cost, divide that by your floor area, gives you a cost per square metre. But is there any breakdown of materials? I understand that there's a bit missing at that stage because it is just feasibility. They might not know whether they're going to have floating timber floors or polished concrete or what have you. But
they might not have even entertained the structural integrity of it yet. I mean, certainly before council and even before construction approval, building approval, you won't even have structural drawings. So you won't necessarily know that. Early on, it might be something that we're looking at functional areas. So if you think about, say, a bigger community type scenario or a commercial development, they might actually be saying, well, we want to build 4,000 square metres of commercial space over 2 levels there, and we want to be able to build civic amenity here at about 5,000. So it's master planning type scenario. So they don't even have internal or external walls depicted or the actual size of each footprint, just what they want to have. They might be looking at it from a lettable sort of scenario where we want to deliver to this community 5,000 square metres of office space because we know that that's what the area needs, right? So they won't have even internal walls or those things sort of drawn up yet or specified. The same in residential. Early on, it might be footprint. We want to build a 250 square metre house or around 300 square metre house. The drawings don't even have internal walls on them yet, number of bathrooms, but they're trying to see what they might be able to get or fit. Because part of this process might actually be trying to understand what can be fit on this particular site from an approval point of view, and what's the maximum yield, especially if they're talking about maybe wanting to build three-story, 3-bed townhouses or 4 2-story, 2-bedroom. They're trying to ascertain functional areas before full design is done.
Yeah, okay. And I understand you've issued a white paper on construction costs of different types for projects up to 30 mil. So we'll chuck that in the site note in the show notes as well. So presumably that is kind of the same sort of thing where it's a preliminary cost plan where you don't have all the information. But if you are just looking from a feasibility point of view to go, okay, I want to build 6 townhouses, then you can roughly say, well, at a standard size and a standard finish, it's going to be in a ballpark of X.
Yeah, and we would have conversations with the client and saying, well, okay, from what we're seeing in the market in this area, they're going to want full height tiling to bathrooms, so we're going to be applying that. Or do you not want that? Do you want it to be only skirting tile or 1,200 to vanities or whatever it might be, or 2 metres to showers, just try and save on the tiling costs? Or it might, so everyone will have a different sort of take on that. You might also find that a client is early on thinking that they're going to be providing a lot of material direct to a builder. So they're having those kind of thoughts around those things because they're going to be providing it.
Yep. Okay. So let's go to the next step where you've done that work and the project stacks. So we need to go to the next stage. We're going to engage presumably an architect or a draft person. So during that sort of design development stage, what's a QS's role in, say, making sure the design stays on budget, or what sorts of reporting can you do pre-construction during that design and tender phase?
Yeah, so there'll be more detail in the plans now. So we're getting a bit more, we're still in the scoping stage, but we're certainly putting a lot more meat on the bones. We're starting to see internal walls come in, level of finishes, and especially around, say, flooring and walls. So is it going to be plasterboard? Is it going to be masonry and a set on it, or render for internal walls or external walls? So we're starting to see that defined. And then we're starting to see floor finishes, might be polished throughout, or tiles just to wet areas and carpet and the like. So we might not know wool carpet or alternatives. We might not know whether it's going to be vinyl or hardwood or some other laminate type floating floor, but we've got an idea that we're going to do a floating floor at least. and we're certainly going to do carpet to bedrooms or not, and something else. So that conversation is now starting to come into play, especially as the architects sort of designing that up further. They need to know those things. They don't need to know exactly what's going on, but they need to know, well, if we're doing a floating floor, that's going to affect our set downs in our bathrooms. So we need to have an idea, are we got to allow for 10 mil or 20 mil, or are we got to allow for 4 mil because we're going to do vinyl? So they're starting to look at those kind of things, not the quality or necessarily the type of specification, but just certainly what the overall look will be, so they can start to counteract that and then have those conversations with the client. They'll start to specify the structure of the development, because when at that point you're coming up closer to being able to have that conversation with council in regards to how this is going to look externally. We then, because in parallel to that, an architect will be starting to work with energy consultants for Basic and Nathers and those like, so to try and get some energy rating to this particular property. So we'll start to see the total square metres of glazing, and whether it's north facing and its topography on the site and the size of certain rooms because of that. And then that will start to have that will start to play with, okay, based on having that amount of windows and the roof structure having a good overhang, like with eaves or whatever, we won't need as much in regards to air conditioning, or which is a big cost driver on a site. Or yes, we will need to do that because we're not going to be able to do that amount of glazing in that particular spot. So we're certainly having those sort of conversations and applying rates to those centres. Equally, in parallel to that, we're starting to look at its exact location, because we're starting to look at fire stuff as well now. So certainly if it had a BAO 12.5, the BAO rating, the bushfire rating, we can start to see, okay, it's going to need these mandatory things. We don't have the house designed yet, but we know it's going to need X, Y, and Z because of that BAO rating. Or it's BAO 40, so we know that it's going to have certain window qualities or screens on windows, or it's flame zone, so it's going to have shutters. So we don't need to know the size of the shutters yet, because we haven't actually worked out all of the window sizes, but we know we're going to have to start to put allowances in our cost centres for these things that are driven by external consultants.
And at what point does the level of documentation sort of cross over from a preliminary cost plan to a detailed cost plan? I mean, can a detailed cost plan still be based on some assumptions, or are you actually just pushing it all in there because the design's got to a point?
Yeah, no, we will be using assumptions. And the reason for that is that we know that they're going to need something around that, but instead of just excluding it, we don't have the full detail of it, but we need to start to put cost centres against it. So we will know on this particular site that it's not going to have sewer. It's going to have to be on septic. So instead of just excluding it because it hasn't been designed yet, we'll start to put money against these cost centres to help build it up.
Yep. So in terms of the chronologic nature of the report, we've got the preliminary report, then we sort of move into more of a detailed cost plan. We've also got the unrated bill that you talked about, and then there's the council DA submission as well. And I know there's some councils that would require a QS sign-off. So kind of put those in order for us and how that flows normally.
Yeah, so if we talk about the preliminary cost estimate, that's normally pretty early, and we might do a few options to that, because the first option might not stack. So we're going to should run 2 or 3 different options. So there might be a little bit of reporting in that. But then once they progress to that next point, we go into that detailed cost plan part. Now that can be that can be a very wide part. So what we tend to typically refer to is a percentage of documentation. So we might sort of say, okay, we've got 50% documentation, or 70% documentation, or 80 or 90. So when we start to talk about 90% documentation, like all the floor finishes have been specified, and certainly all those levels of finishes in there. And we're getting very close. 100% is going to be, being able to go to a builder, and a builder being able to price this up and give them a pretty robust number and entertain signing a contract. So if we come back to that detailed phase, and where it's say 50%, that's more around where you're going to be for your council submission. So you would be doing that in parallel, because council aren't looking at whether it's going to be a slab on ground, or it's going to be a timber frame, or what the upper floor is going to be built of. They're looking at it more of, are they going to approve this type of development? So if you can imagine a residential community and I want to build a church, it doesn't matter what it's being built of, its use as well, right?
Yeah.
So that they might not want that in this little cul-de-sac street. So they're working on DCPs and LEPs at council, right, to work out whether they're going to even allow this development in its first instance. And then as that progresses through to building approval, that's around the performance of the building, the structural integrity. Like, will this thing actually stand up or blow away that the architect has drawn? So that's when they are absolutely specifying slab thicknesses, footings, piering, what the walls are built of, its heights, upper floors, and the like.
So when the council requires a quantity surveyor's sign-off, it's not necessarily anything to do with the type of dwelling it is, because, I mean, that's really part of the development submission, and that's the design by the architect or the draftsperson. It's not necessarily to do with the construction materials. Obviously, there'd be certain things that are allowed that fit with the streetscape, but when a quantity surveyor is involved from that council DA perspective, they're wanting to know the cost for the calculation of DA fees. Is that the way that works?
The Geared for Growth Property Investing podcast is presented by our business, MCG Quantity Surveyors. If you're an investor or a property professional looking to get the best tax depreciation deductions for yourself or your clients, please get in touch with us at mcgqs.com.au. It's our mission to help as many property investors as we can to maximise their claims and maximise their property education as well.
Yeah, so typically referred to as your 711s or 712s, which were what they used to refer to as your Section 94 contribution. So that's things for, it's a levy that typically will be then used for common infrastructure in that area. So it covers costs for obviously your garbage pickup, your curb and guttering, street trees and those kind of things. But then part of that levy is also for, providing common assets in the area like parks and footpaths and things for the community. So if you think about if you're building a 10-unit development and they're all three bedders, there is potentially 30 people moving into that particular building. That's 30 more people in that street that they need to provide probably some extra assets for in that local community and area. So that is only earmarked for that. Council can't then just go and build, spend that on, whatever they want. It is earmarked for that public infrastructure.
Yep. Okay. So we've got the detailed cost plan at, let's say, 95% level of documentation. The client's umming and ahhing about a couple of things. We've done the DA submission, and that's likely to be approved. Or at least we've got enough confidence that we want to start going to tender for builders. You talked about an unrated bill, which, as I understand it, it's basically looking at all of the different trades without a value on it, so they can go, all right, well, this is the let's just say the rendering trade, and there's this many square meters worth of rendering, and then the renders can say, well, this would be my price. But I understand that without doing that process, builders might come and throw the tenders at you, but it's difficult to understand their pricing because they don't necessarily group it in a uniform way, whereas using a quantity surveyor forces them to do it on a line-by-line basis. I'm wondering how much merit there is in that statement and what problems it would cause if they aren't able to compare apples to apples.
Yeah, look, I think it does two things. It controls an apples and apples for that person to be reviewing that tender, but equally it fleshes out concerns from builders because they'll go, well, we like the pricing, it doesn't fit with that. Like, have you included for this, this, and this? So it helps to build an inclusions and exclusions list in the background from that particular builder. It's forcing them to look at it, as opposed to a builder just quickly throwing an eye over something and putting a lump sum on a job, and they actually haven't really drilled down on what's involved in it. So it could actually be you can do it a couple of ways. You could actually provide an unrated bill where the client is saying to all of the builders, this is what I want you to use and price back on. Or provide that as for information only, as a guide to make sure that they're ticking all of those things off. Because what they don't want is this process to go to 3 or 4 builders, and 2 of them have excluded 2 or 3 things that are big cost centres. So they're trying to force them to sort of do that. Equally, what the other alternative is that you get the quantity surveyor to do that tender review, where he does actually do a full priced version himself, and then the builders provide their own, and it would then be up to the QS or the client to go back to that builder to go, your tiling looks very low compared to, have you got some cost for that somewhere else? And then try and find those instances where there are ebbs and flows across the different submissions.
Yeah, can you give us an example of where, say, 2 builders might have a different methodology that does fundamentally change the contract price?
Yeah, so overheads are a perfect example. A builder, a 1 or 2 man band building company might not have much in preliminaries. So things for site offices and fencing, temporary fencing and services, site supervision, but they might not actually have project manager fees in their preliminaries, because themselves as the owner or the builder is going to be on site every day, so they're going to also be head carpenter and project manager. So their fees they have across every trade, as opposed to it being in a lump sum under preliminaries. Right. Equally, another company won't actually, the person doing the price and who has the builder's license isn't actually the project manager on the site. And that project manager might be looking after 15 projects, but then equally on that job, they'll have a site or a construction manager or a site foreman that is just on that job every day. So once again, they might have his labour across some trades or all in preliminaries. Another good example is that you metalwork and steelwork. So sometimes you'll have a builder put a garage door indoors, or he'll have it in his own trade, garage doors, or he might have it under metalwork. So if I'm just looking at someone's submission and say, oh, they haven't got anything for a garage door, they've missed it, it could be under metalwork.
Mm. Or the metalwork looks really high compared to this other tender, like maybe they're just more expensive, but the reality is, well, they included the garage door, so the price is higher, right?
Yeah, and a builder might have quite a high price for windows. And equally, you look at another builder's price and his windows aren't that bad, like it's a lot lower. But they're not using the window company to do the installation, right? So one company has got the installation against carpenter or their team of carpenters that are installing the windows. So to actually put the windows in as a total price, they've got a bit of money in carpentry and a bit of money in windows, right? Equally, another builder might be going, we're not using the window company to do the installation, but under the window trade, we're going to have the install costs as well.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So we've done this process. We went out to tender. We've compared our apples versus apples, and we've picked somebody to go with. Then we get to the construction phase. So how does a quantity surveyor work in the construction phase? And let's presume that for this project, it's not going to be paid in cash. It's actually going to be financed through a finance company or a bank. Where does the quantity surveyor get stuck in there?
Yeah, so the most common scenario we see is going back to a question you asked early on, which was, when does a quantity surveyor get involved? In a lot of cases, enter left on stage is now the quantity surveyor at this point. And a contract has already been signed, or certainly the conversation around a contract and its inclusions are a long way down the road. The signature isn't on the page yet, but to make fundamental changes to that contract is upsetting the apple cart. And that's where we often will come in at that point, because the client has gone to the bank to get money and the bank has said, we're going to need a quantity surveyor on this to make sure these costs are right. And are there any issues in the contract? So that's sometimes the first time a client is hearing about it. Equally, if we've already been on the job, I'll probably talk about that first. We're already on the job. So now the client is looking at going with builder A, and they would contact that builder and say, are you proposing a particular contract, construction contract on this job, or are we doing that as the client? In most cases, a builder would want to propose the type of contract that they would want, and they would provide that in draft form. And it's going to have various clauses in it that are either in favour of the builder or the client. So typically your MBA, your Master Builders Association contracts, or your HII HIA, your Housing Industry Association contracts, are builder focused. So they, in terms of risk, they're looking after the builder more as opposed to the client. And then equally, if you go to an Australian standards type of contract, then it's more in favour of the client as opposed to the builder. So no contract in Australia can be totally biased to one party. So it has to be reasonably equal, and otherwise, it's just going to end up in court anyway. And if it is totally unequal, it gets thrown out regardless of it being signed, right? So the reality will be that the builder will propose a contract, but there'll be certain clauses in there that the quantity surveyor, worst case, but hopefully you've already had some advice prior to that, are pointing out to you that we need to make sure that there's some reasonableness to that particular clause. So things like a defect liability period. So at the end of a job, when the job is finished, there's a certain time program as depicted in the contract as when the builder has to come back to make sure any defects that have occurred during the build or just after have been rectified. Mm-hmm. So a builder will want that to be, as on the shorter side. They don't want to have a defect liability building a house for 3 years, because for 3 years, if there's a crack that comes up in a wall, they've got to keep on coming back to fix it, right? Yeah. So they will sort of look to have that on the shorter side, but then a client is going to want it on the longer side. They're going to want 100 years, right?
Yeah.
So the reality is there's always going to have to be a compromise on a job, but inevitably we'll be looking at going, well, we think 12 weeks is a bit low. The industry standard would be 26 weeks on a house, so half a year, 6 months that they have to come back to fix up those defects. So some parties won't budge, and the reality will be they will need to then make a decision whether this contract or this particular job is for them. So there are some other clauses, liquidated damages, just the programs, making sure the builders have insurances in place. Have they got experience on this type of build in this type of area? So you might have a builder that has built 500 homes, but they've never built one with a basement.
Right.
So it's not that the builder is incapable of doing that, but that builder has never had to engage subcontractors that do piering and shock creep and bulk excavation down to 3 meters, right? So it's the risk on that job is the scope creep and the cost increase, because that builder isn't experienced in managing those type of trades. Where does he even find them? He won't have even used them before, so he's not going to have a relationship with them. So there are things like that we would be looking for early on. If we haven't come in before there where we can guide the client on that, then we're kind of letting them know after a contract is signed that this is going to be a bit of an issue. Probably the really big issue that we see from a potential conflict on a job at this point is in the contract there'll be a clause around progress payments. So how a job is going to be funded moving forward. So a builder might have proposed that it's going to be under a milestone. So when the job hits a certain stage, so when he gets to a certain stage, might be base stage or frame stage or fixing stage, they get an agreed lump sum amount of the contract price. But the client might be engaging the bank in the financial contract on a very different model, and that might be on a fixed to site. So instead of it being when he gets to a certain stage, it's only going to be when all the materials have actually been fixed to site. So we would pick up on that early on and say, hey, there's a potential conflict here. So one doesn't overwrite the other. It just exposes the client on the shortfall. So if it was that the builder, just because you sign that financial contract doesn't overwrite the legalities of the construction contract. You've got to, as that person who has signed both, the onus is on you now. So it might be that when the builder gets to base stage and asks for $100,000 as agreed, the quantity surveyor says, well, they've only done $30,000 worth of concrete to site. The bank's only going to want to fund 30. The builder's saying, well, no, we agreed on 100 when I got to this point. The client's going to be up for 70 grand shortfall. So it's making sure they understand that risk profile moving forward.
So if we were there from the beginning, then as quantity surveyors, we would have the construction cost, and then we're sort of giving that advice around the contract. If we're coming in, stage left, as you said, the first step would be to do an estimate based on the documentation that we've got, so that we can establish a starting point for the value of those staged or those progress claims, right? So the first stage might be the ground floor slab, for example, and then we can say, okay, well, this is the value of that in the contract. And yeah, you're talking about a potential conflict where the client might be getting paid, let's say $30,000 from the bank at that point in time, but the builder's contract is saying, well, once I get to ground floor slab, that's worth 100K. And so a quantity surveyor is checking that out. But what sort of report are we talking about there? Is it a contract review, or how would somebody ask to engage a quantity surveyor to help with that, to protect them?
Yeah, it depends what they're using it for. So if they were using it through the bank, we would call that a financier's report, a financier cost plan. If they were just contacting us direct, knowing that they're going to use that in future for that, we would still do that report the same. If it was just purely they wanted to get an idea about a builder's costs, we would do that as a detailed cost plan, like a 90% cost plan.
Yep. Okay.
So the part of the measure with the quantities and the costs are the same in both reports. The difference in the reports are really the other reporting things. So we aren't talking about programs and all the clauses in contracts and their experience and insurances if we're just doing a 90% measure.
Yep. For the purposes of time, we won't talk about some of the things that you do post-construction, but there's still quite a bit that can go on during construction. So we've established a budget, we've reviewed the contract, and the contract is appropriate. We've made sure that the milestones match up from the builder and the financier, so we're not exposed either way. But presumably there's still a few things that can go wrong. A quantity surveyor is not just going there once a month or every time they hit a progress stage and saying, yeah, it looks like it's fine to release those funds because they've done X, Y, Z. What are some of the common areas where a quantity surveyor is adding value or protecting the client or even the bank at that stage?
Yeah, the main thing we would be looking at all times is the program. So the program would, and how that relates to the actual progress on the site says a lot. So if we're going out to a site where the builder has provided a program that they're going to be at all the frames stood by the end of June, and we're going out at the end of June and we're still only yet forming up for concrete for the ground slab, there's a few questions to be asked, and depending on the reasons for that, we might need to dig a bit more. So the reality could be it's just been really wet, there's been a lot of inclement weather and there have been delays, or there might have been a dispute with a neighbour or council or something and that has slowed a job up, and that might be fine. But there could be some other things at play that are going to have a detrimental effect on the client, because any job that goes late, someone is incurring costs.
Right.
So the builder, if a job was going to be finished by a certain date and it takes longer, then if the builder would be incurring more insurance costs and overheads running on that job, he's got to rent his site fence for longer, all those kind of things. Now, if he's absorbing that, that's fine, it's putting him under financial pressure to perform on the site. Equally, if the client would be has got holding costs, they're paying interest on the money they've already drawn down from the loans with the banks. Someone is always absorbing costs when a job goes late. So when we're looking at program, when we go out to site and go, well, by June you're meant to have the frames up, you're still only forming up for concrete. It could be that builder has 5 other jobs on, and they're in a bit of trouble on the other 5 jobs, and they just don't have the funds to continue on this job, or they've had a relationship breakdown with that particular subcontractor, the concreter, and that might not actually be on this job. It could be that he's used him on another job, and there's a dispute happening on that other job. So that subcontractor isn't doing any more work for that builder until it gets sorted out. So there's some power plays maybe happening on other jobs that are now affecting this client's job. So once again, is that a problem overall? It's going to delay the job by 2 months, and it's still, that might still be appropriate for the client because that's not going to affect them being out of a rental or wherever they are. That might be fine, but it is going to be incurring them more costs from a holding cost. And that builder is now going to be incurring more costs. Is he able to cover that at the end of the job? So early on, we can start to see there might be some issues going on. It might be non-payment to other jobs. It could just be that there are no other issues on the jobs. The builder's just going through something personally. But the problem will be we can see early on that this is going to snowball later.
Yeah, okay. And so let's say it is just a rain delay. Is that a variation to the contract? Is it a request for an extension of time that needs the contract to be kind of amended? Like how is that handled? And I definitely want to talk about variations as well quickly.
Yeah, so there would be a clause in the contract that covers that off, the delays to program, and there would be certain things that you would have to do. So in a particular contract, it may be that the builder needs to provide in writing to the client that because of X, Y, and Z, rain for 3 days, it's now slowed the site by 7 days. Because just because you have 3 days rain doesn't mean it extends a contract by 3 days, because it might take an extra 2 days for the site to dry back out again. So, but they need to put that in writing. So what we would be saying there is, okay, well, if you've had that event and that is the reason, have the extensions of time been submitted? Because if they haven't, the problem will be at the end of the job when the relationship might be under a lot more stress and the builder saying, well, it's late. The client may not have been really aware that that week delay at the start actually translates to the end of a job as well, or more. And it could actually be less, meaning, the builder might have given a year program to build this, but he already had about a month float in there to cover off some of those things. So by being delayed a week early on might not actually extend the job out. But we would want to make sure that that extension of time has been put in, because there are other clauses that are going to come into effect at the end. And if you think of, if you're doing something with a sunset clause, so if you're buying, say, something off the plan and there's a sunset clause on the expiration of when you get access to it, that could have detrimental effect to investors that are, say, buying in this. They might not be able to afford to come in then, right?
Let's talk about the variations, because invariably with a construction project, especially with the bigger construction projects, there's some variation to the contract which could come from the client. They've changed their mind. They said, oh, look, we don't want those windows anymore. We want something else. Or the builder might sort of say, well, look, I made an allowance based on this type of soil, but we've hit all this rock that didn't come up in a geotechnical report, and there might be a legal issue with them. What are some of the common variations to a contract that needs to be handled by an appropriately qualified quantity surveyor? Or let's just say if the client doesn't have a quantity surveyor, what trouble can they get themselves in when something like that happens?
They can absolutely get themselves into trouble. And I would say the main bit of trouble that people get into is the handshake agreement around a variation. Because once again, if a relationship breaks down later on, you've got nothing to come back on. So it's making sure that regardless of whether the variation is legitimate or unapproved, that it's being submitted properly. You need that paper trail to that variation. So even though it might seem pretty obvious, we've had a heap of rain and we've dug the footings, but the footings have collapsed in a bit. We just need an extra day to get an excavator to dig them back out again. It'll be an extra $500. Yeah, no worries, just do it. The problem will be later on if there's a compounding nature to that. So, it really takes very little effort to formalise that on a piece of paper with the builder's letterhead as per the contract, which would say it has to be provided in writing, and because that also might delay a job by a day. So, it's just making sure that they're formalised. The problem will be at the end of a job, if you have to rely on that, you just don't have it and you can't go back to it. So that's the big thing we see. Certainly, first and foremost with a variation, you need to understand whether it's approved. So it might be that the client never asked the builder to do that. So we need to get from both parties that it has at least been approved as a variation. That doesn't mean it's cost or it's quantum. It means, has it been approved to be done?
Yep.
Then when we understand that it is an approved variation, we would then seek to look at contract documents and plans to see whether it is an appropriate variation, whether it can even be submitted, because the plans might have always said that there was to be a brick wall out the front. So if that was already on the plans and the builder has missed it, and he has done his quote and tender and contract off the plans, he's going to have to absorb that. That was on the plans.
Yep. I was just going to ask you for an example of, let's say we take a fairly standard contract like a master builder's contract. What would be an example, and you've just given us one from a builder's perspective, that wouldn't be a reasonable variation? Can you give us another one that wouldn't be a reasonable variation, or a court, if it went that far, wouldn't approve that, compared to, say, a variation that is clear as day that is a normal variation as part of the contract?
So a lot of the variation now we're seeing is really around cost creep. So a builder has priced something, and now, so it might be plasterboard at 30,000, and now the plasterboard company or the plasterers have submitted their invoice saying it's 35. And instead of the builder going back to that subcontractor and saying, well, no, we agreed on 30,000, the quantities haven't changed. That's what it is. I think we're seeing now a little bit of laziness from builders being project managers that are controlling those subbies around their cost centres at that time, and are just probably out of relationship trying to pass that on straight through to the client. Now, it's not necessarily that it's always driven by the builders, right? But the reality is that there is a control that needs to be held in place around that. But it's trying to understand who is managing that. So we'll see now builders wanting to be able to protect themselves in contracts, having an allowance for rise and fall of construction costs. But equally, you've got a client who's looking at that contract going, well, this is no longer a lump sum contract. It's basically saying that my contract can change at any time.
Yeah, and that's the issue, I suppose, that we had with COVID, with the material prices going through the roof, and then there's a fixed price contract, and so that rise and fall clause is in there. But it does beg the question, like, is there such a thing as a lump sum anymore? Maybe it's a bit too much to say that there isn't.
I think it touches on it, right? And I think the problem you have there is that, yes, all those contracts actually meant that the builders couldn't claim for that. And that was the end result, right? The fact. The fact is that the builder signed a lump sum contract, and just because timber went up by 30%, they're not entitled to actually change that. It was agreed on a lump sum. However, when you actually put a signed contract aside and you look at how this is going to affect the job, it actually is in the client's best interest to try and help that scenario out, because if that relationship breaks down then and the builder just can't physically finish the job for that amount of money and they've got to exit, like, I'm sorry, but we're going to go under. So we can't now build this $1.5 million house for the $1 million that we said because of all these cost increases. We're out.
Yep.
So the client is right. Yep. The cost increased by $500K, and that's not right. But the problem is the client's now in a position where they've got to get a whole new builder in. And that whole new builder is going to be costing it at market rates at the moment. Now, they're also going to be adding money in for all the works that the builder did beforehand, because they're now going to take the risk of that and the ownership of that. And they might have to rectify some stuff, or they might just need to have an allowance there in case they do. And they've got to certify those off because there's been electrical works done. And the new builder has their own electrician that they use. So they've now got to get people to come in and do some testing and make sure things have been done to particular standards. So the problem is there. If you're getting a new builder in on a job after an existing, you're going to be paying more anyway. So in that scenario, the builder might have been changing his price by 500,000, but by getting a whole new builder in and the time, because they've got to finish off on another job and you've got holding costs, it might now cost you an extra 700,000 to go with a new builder. Or, you could have just not right, but accepted those. So, there's a bit of give and take on contracts, and that's why I think if people are looking at a contract value to the dollar and the letter of the law, I think you're exposing yourself. I think you need to have that compromise, a little bit of float, that there are going to be scope creep and changes, and how you manage that.
Well, I know that you've been involved in many, many, many conflicts in the construction space, and I think we've elucidated the ways in which a quantity surveyor can protect you against some of those things. But I'd love to get you back later on to talk about some of those horror stories, because people enjoy that sort of stuff. And of course, there can be a really good cautionary tale as well. But thanks for giving us that complete overview on quantity surveying. Admittedly, a high level 101, but appreciate the time today.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, because I think the reality is that a client is entitled to be naive. doesn't mean they have to have built 500 homes before. They're entitled to work with the builder and build their first home. So it's that use of consultants that have done 500 homes, helping represent them.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for your time, Marty. Love the show.